Welcome to this overview of the State Board of Accounts Uniform Compliance Guidelines on Internal Controls for state and quasi-agencies. These guidelines were issued on April 11 and are located on our website on the State Agencies page. Today we will cover Parts 2 and 3 on the evaluation and development of internal controls. The guidelines are in 3 parts. Part 1 covers the 5 components of internal control. Parts 2 and 3 work together for the evaluation and development of internal controls with optional tools and examples. You can see a video on Part 1 on our website on the State Agencies page. Part 2 is organized into 5 sections which correspond to the 5 components of internal control. Part 2 delves into each component by providing an overview, why it matters, where to start, developing internal controls, and documenting internal controls. Each of these topics focus on ways to improve internal controls and make sure all components are present and functioning for the achievement of objectives. So let's talk about each of these topics. The overview section gives a brief synopsis of the component and the associated principles, reminding us of the purpose and requirements for each component. But if you want more detail, you would need to go back to Part 1. Why it matters provides insight on why each component is important. For example, the control environment provides accountability by documenting processes, responsibilities, and actions. Control activities prevent or detect errors or fraud. Monitoring ensures the agency meets statutory requirements. Each component serves important purposes that lead to the achievement of objectives. As we manage our time and review costs versus benefits, it is important to keep in mind why it matters. Where to start considers an evaluation of existing controls. You can approach this in different ways. For example, you can review the overall internal control structure, like whether all principles are functioning for each component, or you can hone in on controls for certain types of transactions, or a combination of the two. To do this, you will need to involve leadership across the agency, including major department or service areas. And this is where Part 3 comes in, with ideas and optional tools for either approach. When it comes to evaluating the overall internal control structure, an internal control evaluation template is provided for each component with a review of common best practices. Another optional tool is the risk assessment template, which may be used to document agency objectives and risks to objectives, including management's response to identified risk. To give you some ideas, example objectives and risks for major transaction areas are also provided in Part 3. So back to Part 2, we have covered the overview, why it matters, and where to start. Developing internal controls comes next. You may decide that additional controls are necessary. You can use the steps outlined in the Developing Internal Controls section to generate ideas on the best approach for your agency. In Part 3, you will find optional tools corresponding to steps in the Developing Internal Controls section. The control development tools provide ideas for control activities, information and communication and monitoring processes for identified risks or needed improvements. Example controls are also provided. The last topic covered for each component is documenting internal controls, which is key to an effective system and the audit process. Methods to document the internal control system include narratives, flowcharts, and standard operating procedures. So let's do a recap of the overall flow of the internal control guidelines. Part 1 has 5 sections detailing expectations for the 5 components and management's responsibility to design and implement internal controls. Part 2 has 5 sections, 1 for each component. For each component, there is an overview, why it matters, where to start, developing controls, and documenting controls. The optional tools in Part 3 correspond to Part 2. For example, when considering where to start, management may wish to look at evaluation tools, the risk assessment template, or examples of objectives, risks, and controls. For the developing controls section, management may wish to review tools like the risk assessment template, the control development tools, or provided examples. Before we conclude, I have 2 things. First, while all 5 components are required, it is management who decides how to design and implement those internal controls. Parts 2 and 3 offer ideas and best practices, but management may choose other methods. Second, this was a short overview. You will see additional information and tools in the guidelines. Stay tuned for information on collaborative in-person sessions to cover this material in more detail. In the meantime, feel free to reach out to State Advisory Services. We are happy to help.